Hey everyone, in this video we'll be studying about the glucose homeostasis from the point that we ingest food, its digestion, and how ultimately the glucose in our blood is balanced and used for vital functions. So let's get started. Here, as you can see, we ingest food, right? Now our food consists of the following macronutrients. So the macronutrients in our food are the carbohydrates. So these are the carbohydrates. Then we have the proteins and we have fats, right? So food usually consists of these three things. So in majority we have carbohydrates, proteins and fats. So carbohydrates ultimately they provide energy. Proteins are used for body build and repair and growth. Fats are used for other purposes like integrity, maintaining the integrity and the health of our skin and other tissues. So when digestion occurs in our body, what happens that when our food reaches to the small intestine, it gets digested. That digestion means breaking down to it's like the simplest form possible. So carbohydrates are all they are present whenever they are present in food. They are present in very complicated forms such as starch, etc. So it gets broken down into something as simple as glucose. So glucose is a monosaccharide and starch is a polysaccharide. Then we have other disaccharides as well, such as maltose, lactose, etc. That gets broken down into a monosaccharide like glucose, and this is what is absorbed through our intestines into our blood. Then proteins get broken down into the simplest form called amino acids, and fats into fatty acids. So all these get absorbed through the gut. In gut we have something called villi, the finger-like structures, which we'll study in digestion chapter. And through that what happens is there is capillaries in them, and these capillaries actually absorb these glucose, amino acids and fatty acids, and they pass it into the portal circulation of our blood. So now what happens, now that our all these are present in our blood already, ultimately we have glucose. So glucose is the main monosaccharide that is for the energy of our cells, right? So I said carbohydrates, the ultimate function is to provide energy, and glucose is the basic form. So what happens is this glucose is the main monosaccharide. So it is the only monosaccharide that can be consumed by our nerve cells, our heart tissue and everything. So all like our brain especially requires glucose for its functioning, and also all other organs. So on the cellular level, glucose is very important. For cellular respiration, etc., glucose is required. It provides energy to those cells. So now what happens whenever we take food, these are present in our food, we absorb all these. Then what happens is if any of these are present in excess, right, what happens, they get converted to glucose upon need, like however it is required. And when there is excess of glucose in our blood, this insulin is stimulated to produce. Like insulin receptors are present in our hepatocytes and adipocyte tissues. So what happens is there is a stimuli generated whenever there is excess of glucose in our blood, that insulin needs to be produced. So when this insulin is produced, glucose in our blood gets lowered down, and this what happens is this excess of glucose get converted into glycogen. Now this glycogen is stored in our liver cells and also in our muscle cells. And when excess of glycogen is present, it gets converted into fat. Now what happens is, if like for example, that's why we say that if we eat too much, we become fat. This is the reason, because glycogen is present, this gets converted into fat. Now there is always some amount of glycogen in our liver cells and muscle cells. So whenever we exercise or work out, or whenever there is sudden need of energy, or we don't have sufficient food, we don't eat, so this helps in sustaining our body through those periods of time. And when again we eat, this glucose is there, and this glucose, if excess is present, gets converted into glycogen, and this glycogen breakdown stops, right? Now what happens is, if for example there is no glucose in our blood, or glucose is very low, we have not eaten, for example, like we are exercising or we have not eaten, this glucagon gets activated. Now what this does is, this helps in breaking down this glycogen and converting it into glucose. for consumption by our body. Now, suppose there is not enough glycogen, like glycogen has also depleted from our body. Like if we are working out, or if we are like not eating at all, or we are having something that does not contain glucose. Like for example, if we are having only proteins and only fats, then these amino acids and fatty acids are also converted into glucose by this glucagon. And as I said earlier, this process is called gluconeogenesis, or formation of new glucose molecule from non-sugar precursors. That is, these are not carbohydrates, these are not sugars, and they don't have this like this quality of giving energy. So their function is not to provide energy, but however they get broken down into glucose. They are converted actually into glucose. Now, if you see the structure of glucose, amino acids and fatty acids, it's pretty much similar. All of these are basically carbohydrates. So we have carbon like in the main chain, then we have hydrogen or other groups attached. So if you know organic chemistry, the carbon and hydrogen, they form organic molecules. So all of these have carbon and hydrogen. However, when it comes to the amino acids, here we have amino groups. So that is why they are called amino acids, because we have an amine group and also we have an acid group. So amine is nothing but NH2 or nitrogen. And also we have acidic group. So COOH is our carboxylic acid or acid group. Then we have other groups attached, and this is our amino acid. This is the basic structure of amino acids. In fatty acids, we have long chains of carbohydrates, like we have C, H. Then if it is branched, we have some other structure. So it is called saturated, unsaturated. So it is a very different structure. It has different structures, and based on that we have different fatty acids. But in carbohydrates, what we have is we have a basic structure. We have a ketone structure. So it has 6 carbon molecules. So total we have in chain 6 carbon molecule atoms are present, and this forms our glucose, fructose and all. So basically, if we remove this NH2 and COOH, and if we do some minor changes into amino acids and all, we can get glucose. So in our body, this occurs and we get glucose in turn. So this is how glucose homeostasis is maintained. So again, when we consume food, what happens? It gets broken down into glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, right? And then this glucose, it goes into the blood, and when there is excess of glucose, what happens? It's like whatever glucose has to be taken up by the cellular respiration, etc. is taken up. So this insulin helps in doing that. So what insulin does is, it as soon as we eat, right, and as soon as digestion occurs after 3 hours, this insulin is produced and insulin peaks in our blood. So when it peaks, what happens is this glucose is taken up for cellular respiration. It is taken for like glycogen conversion. So whatever is left is converted into glycogen, and in turn it's converted into fat. So even if we take excess of proteins and fats too, this also makes us fat, because what happens is, again, this also gets converted into fat by this process. Here what happens is, as I said earlier, when we eat too much, we say that we become fat because of this process. Glucose gets converted into glycogen. Glycogen is the storage polysaccharide, and this accumulates to form fat. But how can we lose weight? When we say we want to lose weight, we are recommended to eat in a calorie deficit, or eat less than what we eat usually. And also we are said to avoid this sugary foods or processed foods. And also we are said to exercise. So whenever we eat something like that is very processed, what happens is the glucose is easily accessible to our body. So it is produced very easily. So our body doesn't have to do any work to produce this glucose. So it gets directly absorbed, and insulin rises very suddenly. So that is why they say don't eat any sugary foods. So what happens when this peaks very suddenly? This becomes like this insulin peaks, and it helps in the formation of fat, right? And that's why they say if we eat in excess anything, it gets converted into fat and we gain weight. But if we have to lose weight, we have to exercise, or we have to eat less. When we eat less or we don't eat much, what happens is this glycogen gets broken down back to glucose and gets consumed by our body. And even when we are exercising, there is glycogen in our liver cells and muscle cells. When we exercise for over 20 minutes, our heart and muscles require energy. So this glycogen gets completely taken up from the liver and from muscle cells, and what happens is it gets converted into glucose. And when this glycogen depletes, this fat starts to get consumed by our body. Fat stores are depleted. Similarly, in this, like we have also our amino acids and fatty acids are taken up. So that is why they say if you work out for excess without eating, in some, like if you are into bodybuilding, your muscle starts to break down. So muscles are made of protein. So this protein gets broken down. Amino acids are also taken up for energy production. So this is how it works. Even fatty acids. So fats in our body, they also get broken down to fatty acids. Also, they also get taken up with the body. So in turn, everything, these two hormones, they help in maintaining glucose levels. So whenever there is a disorder in production of insulin, there is a type of disease called diabetes. So there are two types of diabetes. One is diabetes type 1, which actually is congenital, that is by birth a person has it, and that is when the receptors of insulin don't work, or there is like insulin is not produced in enough quantities. Oh, there is also another type of insulin resistance or diabetes. This is type 2 diabetes. Here there is like the body produces insulin. It produces so much of insulin because diet is not good, or we are eating too much of sugary foods, that to the point that our body starts to not recognize this molecule of insulin. So receptors don't work. So this is type 2 diabetes, and usually this type 2 diabetes develops because of unhealthy eating habits or excessive weight gain, etc. So I'll discuss this both in detail. Now glucagon usually doesn't have any disorders, and it's not like really, like it doesn't affect much, except if it is not secreted properly, then hypoglycemia or low blood sugar can occur. So we'll discuss that also in detail in hormonal disorders. So for now, thank you.